Welcome back to another episode of Strength in the Details. I am here with Zack Lebo of Category 5 Athletics. Really excited to get into some content about programming, athletic development, and general strength and conditioning. How are you, Zack?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me.
Excited to finally have you on here. It took only 2 years, but that's fine.
No problem. Yeah, you got one of my
Uh,
athletes in here before you got me, but we made it finally.
we did. So this episode is a part of a series that I'm doing on coaching and leadership, and I'm trying to get some different perspectives on different aspects of coaching for strength athletes and weightlifting athletes. And so, really excited to have you on here to provide some context for our listeners. Tell us a little bit about your background and expertise as it relates to strength and conditioning and the strength sports space in general.
For sure. Well, I'm going to start with what doesn't relate. I couldn't be much further removed athletically from strength sports, in my younger years anyway. I always tell people I had the complete opposite of a strength sports background. I grew up primarily competing in track and field and cross country. When I went to college, I went to run. I stopped my first year in college. I just wasn't in love with it anymore. And that's kind of when I found the weight room in general for the first time. I had no idea what I was going to school for. This is going to get to the professional part. I knew some part of me wanted to stay involved in athletics. I wasn't sure how. Growing up, my answer was always, I want to be a professional athlete. And I never really knew what that meant. I kept bouncing that idea around. And then it was, I want to work with athletes. And I didn't even know what that looked like. Funny enough, I didn't even know that strength and conditioning was a profession until I was about 2 years into my undergrad. But anyway, so fast forward, in 2014, I graduated with a degree in exercise science after switching majors a couple times, starting in athletic training and physical therapy, pre-physical therapy. And that's kind of what led me into the strength and conditioning field to begin with, initially getting involved in strength sports as a strength and conditioning coach. I spent my first year post grad working primarily at the university level with team sports. I did 2 internships with 2 different Division I colleges. Then I spent a year doing private sports performance down here in Tampa. That was my first experience down here in Florida, where we are now. And then the most recent job I held before getting into Olympic weightlifting specifically and owning the gym and opening all that up was as a strength coach for an arena football team. Unfortunately, I'm not sure that league is still a thing. So I've been fortunate to have a lot of exposure to everything from professional athletes to college and high school athletes at a high level, to now really specializing working with just competitive weightlifters. It's kind of the direction I've been going in for the last 5 or 6 years now. And that's where we are.
You keep using this word professional athlete. I'm curious in your perspective from all of those different experiences, what is a professional athlete? What does that mean?
Well, in the past, the idea of professional was always paid to do that as their job, at least part-time or full-time. The best example I had was with that arena football team. These are people that during the season, at least, they worked no other jobs. Their whole job was to show up, practice, train, etc., go to meetings. I think it looks a little different in Olympic weightlifting. Kind of dive into that a little bit further, but being a professional in an Olympic sport typically is a little bit harder. Even some of the more popular ones like swimming and track and field, getting the type of funding you need to solely focus on that sport is really tough. So, my definition of it would be a professional athlete in the Olympic sport world, especially in something like weightlifting, is the athlete whose priorities rely around training and competition first, and the rest of life pretty much comes second. Everything from job choices, even sometimes stepping back from a career or changing jobs to fit your training schedule more. That to me is when you start crossing that threshold of being a professional versus just being someone who's in it for the hobby of it. And neither one is right or wrong. Everyone, I think, starts more at that recreational level. They just want to learn, and you grow into kind of that transition to being a professional, if you will.
Yeah. I would agree. Most athletes, including myself, I got into it because it was something that I was terrible at, and I go, "Oh, let me try to get less terrible at this sport." And so I really developed a passion for it. Never thought it was going to be something that I would transition into coaching and developing other athletes. But a lot of athletes do get into it as a hobby. Some of them more recently get into it with these big ideas and aspirations of, making it to the Olympics or making an international team. From your experience, how do you introduce the idea of Olympic weightlifting to those novice or beginner or newer athletes who may have aspirations that don't quite align with where they are physically at the time?
Right. And the first thing I always tell everyone is, yeah, I'd rather the athlete walk in on day one and be like, I want to go to the 2028 games, or I want to represent Team USA. I'd rather them overreach in their dreams or their aspirations. And then we can kind of pull back a little bit and talk about what that journey might look like. The jumping off point for me is always, just laying out very clearly, like the first couple of years, you just need to spend time in the gym. So you're not going to become a professional lifter overnight. You're going to progress rather quickly, hopefully as a beginner, and that's great. But there's still such a large gap to close between that first day in the gym. And a lot of it to me has to do with, are you walking into being a weightlifter having never done a sport before? Or are you fortunate enough, where you're a former college athlete of some kind, or you've played team sports growing up, where you've at least got some background and just generally being, strong and active and maybe moving your body in an athletic manner that will transition over to weightlifting. Because if not, that conversation becomes very different. I am a big believer that good athletes make good weightlifters. So if you haven't developed at all as an athlete before starting weightlifting, there's a lot of other things that need to be covered other than just learning to snatch and clean and jerk, the part everyone's like, oh, I just want to lift heavy and give me a year or two, I'll be a world champ. Like, well, let's worry about learning how to squat and eat right and sleep right and, kind of figure out what our body is telling us to do on a day to day, and we'll eventually build up to that bigger goal.
Your experience with a lot of different athletes in various sport disciplines, and including Olympic weightlifters who train all year round. So, what are the considerations that you might have for the yearly planning for the holistic athletic development, or the development of the whole athlete in that span?
First and foremost is there other obligations outside the gym. I actually think I saw you put a post up recently regarding, the amount of time we spend in training as, say, a new lifter, a non-professional athlete of any kind. And it accounts for 2-3 hours a day at most, 4 to 6 times a week. Again, at most. Most lifters aren't starting with 5 or 6 training sessions. It may be 2 or 3 or 4. So kind of the first part of developing that is getting them to get control of the rest of their life. Again, teaching them that part of being an athlete at any level is taking care of your body when you're not training. I think everyone walks in the gym and it's, I must train harder than everyone else. It's like, I got news for you. Most people don't have a problem training hard. That's the part we all love. It's fun to go to the gym, throw heavy weights around and sweat and be with your teammates or whatever environment you're in. But to me, kind of that holistic journey of planning a year out is making sure we're managing stress both inside and outside the gym year round. Whether it's the holidays come up and we need to take a step back, or they travel for work during certain times of the year. Making sure that both myself as the coach and the athlete understand, like, training is going to ebb and flow a little bit with that. We're going to push during certain periods of the year, and other times it's okay if we're doing less sport training, as long as we're still doing something that keeps moving that needle closer to the long-term goal.
Is that something that you do proactively or kind of reactively, or somewhere in between?
I would say a little bit more in between. That is the part that is a little more individualized to the athlete. Every incoming lifter to our team first has a meeting with myself. We can kind of lay out expectations and start discussing some of this stuff and get a feel for, some of those things, stress management, how their schedule lines up with training, where their goals and aspirations are. And then that kind of gives me a jumping off point for how much we need to change what we're doing inside the gym. And as they get further along, our lifters who are lifting at the higher levels, we go a lot deeper into that stuff. Things like planning out a year in advance training wise, which of course is just rough framework, all the way out to planning, maybe a quad at one time and discussing what we're going to be doing in years 2, 3, and 4 at a base level.
So that requires a lot of communication. Can you talk about how you as a coach have worked on your own communication, having to, interact with lots of different people, athletes who may, have different communication styles? How do you get them to kind of buy into your plan, and how do you explain that to different people?
For sure. I've certainly made mistakes in my first couple of years of thinking that, I think like all coaches, we think, our plan is the best way to get from A to B. Everyone's going to follow the same path, just like an athlete might think everyone's going to kind of go in that same linear path towards whatever their goal is. And I have learned really probably the biggest thing for the last 6 years now, working in weightlifting specifically, was that kind of what you said earlier, like everyone's path is going to be a little bit different. And I need to learn to listen to them as much as I expect them to listen to me, whether it's about, things that they may struggle with mentally in the sport, their own confidence, things that are holding them back other than the physical side of training. And realizing that it's my job to figure out how to get them to that next step, aside from just, writing a great program is great, coaching the lifts in a good technical manner is awesome. But if we're missing all those other pieces, so I guess to sum it up is just, asking the right questions and really listening to the answers, not just, well, you have to do it this way because this is what good athletes do. Like, well, that's what that good athlete might do, but depending on your age and your social life and your job, like maybe there's a different way we can have that approach and still kind of get the best of both worlds. We can achieve what I want to as the coach, being in charge of the program, and cater to the athlete's life for whatever choices they need to make outside the gym. So
You bring up a lot of really great points, and I think that's something that, as you indicated, a lot of newer coaches that get into coaching have to learn. I mean, I had to learn it myself, is that like you have all of these ideas. You certainly have the education and training and the credentials and the experience. But at the same time, the athlete is kind of an expert in themselves and their life and their body and what they're feeling from a psychological and physical standpoint. And having to balance that can sometimes be challenging, especially when, you want to communicate something and the athlete maybe isn't buying in. So I think that's something that coaches could actually really use and learn, aside from learning, periodization and macrocycles and mesocycles, which is what we tend to spend a lot of time on. And that kind of what was the impetus of that post that I shared a little bit. We focus so much on the training, and honestly, most of us come into training excited about training, and so that's usually not the problem. Sometimes it is, but usually it's not. And
right.
so usually it's like all of the things that you did leading up to training or didn't do. How do you educate your athletes on the things that they're doing outside of training that might influence training?
I outsource a lot, whether it's kind of passively, meaning, I'll give them books that I've read, documentaries to watch or listen to, where they can listen to other people who are experts at being athletes or experts at nutrition or sleeping or different daily habits. Like, go listen to the people who do this for a living, just like I expect them to listen to their coach for weightlifting. My job is more so to guide them to the right answers, not to try and necessarily give them all to them. While I certainly think all coaches should have part of the answer, I can teach you basics of sleeping and how to fuel your body the right way. Part of it has to be exploration on the athlete's part. It can't just, it's just like coaching in the sport. I can't just give you the answer. I can teach you what I need you to do, and I can certainly facilitate your learning, but you have to be the one that's still eager to go out and find the answers, like you said, for the individual athlete, because not everyone's going to have the same one. So that would be my first way. The second is we do a lot of routine goal setting meetings to kind of evaluate what we're doing, training and outside of. Usually twice a year at the end of our big training blocks, somewhere around our priority meets for the year. We'll sit down, we'll evaluate, what went well first performance wise, the basic stuff, and then we'll start digging into, what else can we be doing to get better in the gym if we feel like we have shortcomings there. Maybe someone performed great and the answer is, we're doing all the right things. Here's how we take that next step. Or, we came up short at a competition or in a training cycle, and, everything in the gym seemed to go well. So we need to start fishing outside the walls and see, what's happening with you that, you're not seeing progress, but someone else that's doing the same thing in the gym might be. So I hope that kind of answers that.
Yeah. So, Zach, many people consider competitive weightlifting highly specialized, highly skilled, very technical, and we snatch and we clean and jerk. That's what we do. We compete in two lifts and we spend all year doing that. And I know that one thing that you're really big on and known for is the idea of general physical preparedness. So, you know, approaching things that aren't specific to weightlifting that all athletes kind of need to get better. What is general physical preparedness, or GPP, and why is it so important for you that weightlifters and strength athletes kind of have this incorporated into their training?
So I'll try to keep relatively short-winded. First of all, GPP to me for a weightlifter, I've always made the comparison here that, a weightlifting athlete and a weightlifting coach, like that's the sport. And then everything else we do is strength and conditioning, really. It's like we still have to train all of the other areas of performance that weightlifting doesn't cover. And while the snatch and clean and jerk may be great ways to work on a lot of those pieces, there's still just one piece of that bigger pie. So GPP to me really is anything that is not directly or indirectly the snatch, the clean, the jerk, or any of the pulls and squats that are the exact, mimics of those movements. So, if we're deadlifting, but we're doing sumo deadlifting or stiff leg deadlifts, more conventional strength work, or we're using accommodating resistance like a power lifter might, even down to doing some conditioning circuits, doing metcons like a CrossFitter would. It's like all of those are pieces of becoming a better weightlifter. And that ties back to what I mentioned earlier, where it's, if you're coming from a different sport background, you might not need as much of that. You've done the general groundwork, you've laid the foundation, and you can get into that kind of specialized performance part of weightlifting a little bit sooner. And I think that's where a lot of newer lifters get confused. They might see one of our, Team USA lifters who, they've been lifting for 2 or 3 years and they're lifting at the international level. But what they didn't see is that they were a sport athlete in team sports or maybe another individual Olympic sport for 15 years before they found weightlifting. Well, that was their GPP. They did general strength training, they did conditioning, they did other sports to work on things like balance and coordination and just generally learning how to move their body. So that's kind of where my definition of it starts. If we haven't done those things, that's the first thing we need to address in the gym. We'll learn how to lift, but that's going to be, one fraction of the time we spend. The rest is going to be working on mobility or stability or just general body awareness in different planes of motion. Unfortunately for weightlifting, we move in one plane the whole time. It's pretty straight up and down for the most part, the exception of splitting our feet for a jerk if you're a split jerker, which most are. But that only covers a very small piece of all the different types of movement that are out there and the ways that our body wants to move. And, I think the argument for that is in weightlifting, well, if we don't need to work on, say, we don't rotate in weightlifting. No, but we need to not do that. So sometimes learning how to not do it, we have to learn how to do it, even though it doesn't directly apply. So that's my long-winded answer to, what is GPP? Anything that's not the barbell movements that we love to do so much. And that's going to change throughout the year. Sometimes it's very far removed, and sometimes we're just, a piece or two removed from the full competition lift, trying to work on little pieces or strength movements that will help aid in those larger lifts.
Yeah. So I heard you say the word conditioning, metabolic conditioning, actually. So, Zach, are you suggesting that strength athletes need a little bit of metabolic or cardiovascular conditioning in there?
I am absolutely suggesting that. Coming from someone who is about as anti-cardiovascular exercise as it gets, because I spent so much of my time as a younger athlete doing that type of training. But to me, the simple answer is it really comes back to the idea of like work capacity and our body's ability to recover. And I don't think there's any doubt that having higher aerobic thresholds in training definitely helps our body with general performance and recovery. It's kind of the same argument. Why do we bother doing even just high volume strength work if we just lift heavy in our sport? Well, you need that foundation of work to be able to sustain high intensity levels of work. Just as, a distance runner still has to do speed work to work on certain qualities of their running, even though the majority of their time is spent doing longer durations of training. A weightlifter doesn't need to spend a lot of time conditioning, but they still need that piece of overall fitness and performance. It helps their body recover, helps them feel better in between those heavy training sessions. So I know we don't like that answer. But again, if it's something we've never been exposed to, someone's been pretty sedentary for 20 years, like there is definitely a part of their life that has to revolve around conditioning and doing aerobic work, even though we are an anaerobic sport.
Right. I will make sure that I take this little piece and blast it for all of my strength athletes. And I think the trouble is when we say cardiovascular activity, if you're not familiar with like CrossFit and CrossFit WODs and things like that, you immediately think we're saying, oh, you need to go run, right? Like you need to go run a mile. And we're not saying that, or at least that's not what I'm thinking you're saying. What would you integrate into a program at some point in the cycle that you would consider appropriate metabolic conditioning for a strength athlete?
Right. So, one, please don't blast that all over the internet. No one will ever come join my gym again if every weightlifter thinks I'm going to make them run or ride the bike or the rower. But to me, what it means for most weightlifters or strength athletes in general is one, some outside the gym cardiovascular work for general health, right? Going for a walk, going to swim a couple times a week, whatever is fun and enjoyable for you that just gets you moving. for overall health, which again comes back to just recovering between our heavy training sessions. But inside the gym specifically, for me, it's as simple as, we'll use things like the bike or the rower from time to time, just in short intervals, kind of that higher intensity threshold training, like you might see as part of a CrossFit workout, but it is just a small piece for us. It might be 5 to 10 minutes. Or simply doing our accessory work in a more circuit fashion where we encourage not resting and really trying to get your heart rate up a little bit and doing a lot of lighter movements to kind of work on that idea of conditioning, if you will, a little more specific to weightlifting. It does not mean running. In fact, I'm usually one who's pretty against running for weightlifters, usually for the reasons of impact on the joints, because weightlifting takes a toll, as we know, on our knees and hips and back a lot to begin with. I usually try and steer lifters toward those lower impact ones. Give me circuit work in the gym, give me rowing, swimming, biking, things that aren't going to beat my joints up as much.
And I agree with those. And I think that it's really important. You mentioned general health. I think as athletes, sometimes we either intentionally or non-intentionally overlook that we also need to care for our general health and cardiovascular health and balance and flexibility and all of those things as a part of just being a human and longevity over time. So I can definitely appreciate a little bit of conditioning there.
For sure.
What is your philosophy on approaching macro and mesocycles for weightlifting athletes? What are some things that you put in, ideas, thoughts that you have for developing those?
My first thought that I put in when we start writing training cycles is what may seem like a simple answer, and that is to start at the end, wherever our anchors are date-wise. If it's a year-long or that 4-year-long plan for a more advanced lifter, or we're just talking about, a macro cycle for our general team in the gym might be the next, 14 to 20 weeks, start of the year to our state championship meet. I always start with that end goal in mind. If this is where we want to be lifting our biggest lifts of the year, how are we going to work to that without getting there too soon? I don't want to be necessarily at maximal effort, single rep lifts 2 months out, because I'm not going to sustain that for the 2 months. Then I have to close that gap. So the first thing always is planning for me, seeing how long we could spend working on each of those different qualities we've kind of touched on a little bit, whether it's a strength cycle or a work capacity training block, just divvying up the time. If we have 20 weeks and I know we want, 6 to 8 weeks to prep for the competition, what does that leave me with for my other training blocks? And we'll probably touch on this later then, but looking at the team or the individuals that are on the program, depending on what program it is, and figuring out, based off their assessments of where they're at, how does that mesocycle or macro cycle break down? Are they really well versed in the technical side of lifting and they don't need a ton of that, but they really need a longer strength block to work on getting their squat maxes or their pull maxes up? That's going to help them with the lifts. So kind of just divvying up that time in the beginning is the most important thing for me. And then we'll start to break down kind of secondarily, like once I know where my volume's coming in and my intensity ranges, what lifts make sense to be paired with that. If I'm doing higher volume, should I be doing full lifts from the floor? Are we maybe going to be doing some just block work to take some of that stress off the body while we're doing higher volume squatting and pulling? So I've always looked at it as, my analogy is if you were to jump in the kitchen and say you're going to make something, you don't start by just throwing a bunch of stuff in a bowl and hope it turns out good. Like, you have a recipe first. The coach laying out the meso or macro cycle has to have the end recipe written first. It's just the outline, just like we'd write an essay and bullet point what we want to cover in it. The first thing I'm going to do is lay out all the things that need to be addressed, and then we can get down with a finer comb looking at, how exactly are we going to do that through each training week.
How do you adjust that using, what type of feedback do you look for, and what are you using to track progress across let's say a macro cycle, like a 20-week macro cycle?
Yep. Depends on the level of the athlete. So we'll start with the team version of it, where it's obviously a little bit varied because one group might be doing pretty well during one block and some other people are falling behind for reasons, not related to training. They're having stress at work. So one, I try never to program more than like 2 or 3 weeks in advance on a minutia level. I'm not writing the exact percentages and exercises we're going to be doing. I have that longer outline. So there might be a 20-week plan written, but I'm only going to write out 1 to 3 weeks at a time so I can evaluate each day in the gym when those kind of down weeks need to get thrown in, when we look like we're ready for, a testing week or backing off, because I do think it varies a whole lot, especially when programming for the larger group. If you're not going to do individualized programming, which is tough when you have more than a few, you can't do it for everybody. So really just paying attention to the day to day. I always tell everyone part of it's just being cordial with an athlete when they walk in. How are you doing today? How are you feeling? Are you sore? But part of it really is fishing for information from the lifters themselves. If they're telling me their legs were smoked from Monday, but I was expecting them to feel more recovered, well, I need to ask the entire group and get a feel for, whether or not the program did that and it was supposed to, or is it just an isolated case because, this individual decided to stay up till 2 a.m. And I let all of those little conversations drive how we progress through that longer cycle. Again, the framework is always there. This is how we're going to get through those 20 weeks, let's say, but the individual weeks, they fluctuate a lot. My plans rarely look at the end like they do at the beginning of the training cycle. But the overall framework hasn't changed. It may just be, inserting some different areas of deload where I didn't think we would need it, or maybe we've got to change some rep schemes up. Simple stuff that, kind of makes a big difference in the end.
Yeah, you brought up a really good point and an idea thought that I had. When I first started programming for athletes, I spent a lot of time in the beginning writing out what I thought was the perfect program. Like this is the greatest 16 weeks that you're ever going to experience. And then by the time we get to week 16, I'm like, this is nothing like what I started with. And so I too have, gotten more in the habit of, making those adjustments as we go. But what I have found and what I want to get your thoughts on is that I have some athletes who they're great with that. Like they wake up, they're like, what are we doing today? And, they're good with the fluidity of kind of, coming and going. Then I have some athletes who they're very rigid. And if you write it, it must happen that way. And they're very detail oriented. How do you speak to those two different athletes to make them happy with where you're going and where the program is taking them?
Definitely understand what you're saying. I have dealt with both ends of that spectrum and everything in between as well of, the athlete that wants to see, the program says 87% today, but, they're missing at 80%. Well, clearly we need to change something. So I'll start with that end of the spectrum. If it's those people that are really looking for the details, they want to know exactly what numbers on what day, on what week they're going to hit. I do my best, and it's kind of part of that initial goal setting meeting we have usually that precedes a longer training cycle, kind of lay out for them that, listen, there is a longer plan here, and this is kind of what it looks like. Here's where I need you at certain dates. When we're 4 weeks out, I need you in this range. When we're 2 weeks out, I need you in this range. Right now I need you squatting a certain amount of times a week, and the other stuff can kind of take a back seat. I think having a good understanding beforehand for the athlete is good to know the plan, not just say, hey, just trust me, just follow the program. Because that's when they get really attached to, well, the program said 87% and I can't hit it today. Well, if they know that the program was really written in a way it says 87, but it really means somewhere between 80 and 80, 87 or 80 and 90% based on the day, then I feel like that gives them a little more comfort. And also just seeing the other athletes around them as far as hey, sometimes we'll put it on the board. We're working to heavy triples today on a squat, and I'll write everyone's on the teams on the board so everyone can see, you may have been on the lower end, but you're still right there with the rest of the group. Nothing to worry about. Watch in 3 weeks, maybe you'll be at the higher end of that. I also think that drives some motivational stuff to feel like you want to compete with the other people in the gym. And then you have the other end of the spectrum where people are just yeah, whatever, tell me what to do each day. And I am a fairly detail-oriented programmer. I write a lot of stuff on my programs. There's a lot of notes and percentages and specific volume ranges I want people in. I track stuff that they can see, some that they can't, the majority that they don't. So sometimes they're looking for a little bit of that flow, and I'm kind of rigid, almost to a fault sometimes, but I have learned to adapt with the lifter. Again, that first 5-minute conversation every day during each lift too, how are we feeling today? How do snatches feel? And there's, it feels like a house today. This feels like 100%. Well, great. I want it to feel like a certain percentage. Find that for me for today. Don't worry about the number. Worry about the way the lift feels. And that's probably the way that I would work with kind of that other end of the spectrum where they don't want to be told what number. They want to know what they're trying to work on for that day, and then they'll find that range for me.
Are you using any technology for tracking? And if so, what's working for you and your athletes?
Some. Now, I don't use it with everybody. I don't think it's necessary for a lot of our beginner to intermediate lifters. Tracking for them is a lot of my spreadsheets. I love spreadsheets. track everything we're doing from a overall program standpoint, but with our individual lifters, typically the ones competing at the national level or getting really close to that level. I go a little bit more in depth. We do use some velocity tracking. I don't use it a ton for daily readiness measures. I just haven't found one that I like a whole lot yet. I've played around with a few, but I will use it, especially when we're getting to our heavier weeks. Typically, I work on blocks, so we'll work 3 to 5 weeks at a time, and toward the end of that block, we'll really push whatever our current movements are to heavy, maximal or near max for whatever it is. And usually then I'll hook them up. I'll see where we're at and kind of compare it to their historic data. You're moving X amount of weight at a better speed than you were 5 weeks ago. Or, hey, you may have not gotten to the certain percentage we wanted to get at, but we did more volume in a certain range or at a certain speed. Just more tools to kind of give them feedback as far as, it doesn't always have to be a very precise number. It can be something else we're working on. So that's a couple of the things that we use. Again, I am real big on my spreadsheets. I track a lot of stuff. I build athlete profiles for everyone that comes in the gym, and they're constantly being updated with, maybe we're squat maxing this cycle. As soon as we get into squat maxes, they get plugged in, kind of shows me where we're at with the rest of our lifts. Those are really the two main pieces of technology, if you will. Again, some velocity tracking and a lot of just an ever-growing collection of spreadsheets. Everyone makes fun of how much of a nerd I am with all my spreadsheets and charts, but they help me organize my thoughts when I'm writing training and kind of give me some bullet points, if you will. If an athlete has a problem, we can at least pull some concrete evidence up and be like, hey, here's where we were 6 months ago. Here's where we are now. Here's what has gotten better, and maybe here's what hasn't. So I know tracking things is not for everyone, but it is something that I have found to be particularly beneficial, especially when communicating with the athlete about expectations.
I feel like, tracking objective data helps keep the athlete very objective. I know me as an athlete, sometimes we get very much in our feelings and very subjective about how a lift is feeling or how training is feeling. And so sometimes I think a pro to tracking this objective data, you can go back and say, hey, athlete, I know you may not feel like this went well, or you may not feel that you've achieved some objective, but last time we did this, you hit X number. This time we do this, you've hit this number. And I think sometimes that allows an athlete to kind of get out of their own head and feelings a little bit. What are some other pros and cons of data tracking for athletes?
Cons for sure, if you're like me and you like to look at that stuff, sometimes it starts driving you in a place you don't want to go. Whether you're just misinterpreting the overall trend of the data or you're not seeing the whole picture. It's also very time consuming. It takes a lot of time to sit down, and tracking the basics is pretty easy and straightforward. But if you really dive down the hole and start listening to every other podcast or reading every book about which data to track, tracking 50 different variables during a training cycle, and you're spending no time actually looking at what's right in front of your face. So definitely the con side of it. And sometimes the numbers don't tell the whole story. Maybe the numbers don't look great on a spreadsheet, but the athlete has been dealing with something outside the gym, and it perfectly explains what's going on. They just need some time to turn something else around to get those numbers where you want them. But I would say the pro side of it is, it, like you said, gives you an objective look at things, sometimes both in a good and a bad way. Maybe we're post competition and it went really well. Well, we can go back and say, here's what we were doing leading up to this one. And, hopefully we have some evidence as to why it went so well. Or consequently, the other side of it as a coach and as the athlete, when we sit down and have those conversations, if they ask, why didn't it go well? Well, the first thing I do is go back and look at training. What percentage of makes were we having at a certain, our opener, let's say? Were we not hitting this number well leading into it? Were our strength numbers down? Did we change something in training? Or did I change something on the program that I really didn't mean to, but I had no way of tracking it? As I'm sure you'll agree, as a coach who writes programs, we try to make everything fit in the time we have, and sometimes we don't realize maybe we've cut a valuable piece of training out that we didn't realize was having an impactful benefit. Something as simple as doing RDLs. We cut them out and we replace them with something else, and now that lifter's posterior side feels weaker this cycle, and they haven't felt as strong off the floor. And if I'm not looking at that stuff and where my volume's coming in training, it's hard for me to go back and really find those answers. So that's kind of the pros and cons to me. It has both. It shouldn't replace your job. The numbers alone won't tell the story, but they'll certainly help when you're trying to answer those tougher questions about why things went well or why they didn't. It's, ultimately the coach's job to have those answers. We're not just saying, well, I hope we did things right. I want to be able to look back and say, well, it went well because we did X, Y, and Z. And, wherever we did come up short, we at least have a well thought out reason and plan as to how we're going to make it better the next time.
Hmm. And I would imagine all of that kind of goes into like the psychology of an athlete, whether it be someone who's just enjoying training, they're just a recreational athlete, not just I need to stop saying just a recreational athlete, but it's someone who this is their hobby. They don't have any aspirations of getting, going higher in the sport or achieving some specific goal, or your elite level athletes who this is their number one focus. This is their job. This is something that they really want to go far in. Sometimes tracking data and tracking metrics can appeal to the psychology of performance leading up to a competition. How do you use some of this data to improve the actual performance come competition day?
Well, we'll go back to things like, the velocity tracking, which I've just really started on. I'm not going to pretend to be an expert on it. There are far more experienced coaches out there who have great content on how to use them. I've really just started in the last year and a half or so. But even looking at just like program metrics of seeing how we're tapering for a meet and figuring out like, am I giving this athlete the rest they need to feel good on meet day? Or are we pushing a little bit too hard, too close? Those kind of are the most important ways leading into a competition that I'm going to use any kind of technology or data. It's not, again, really driving the day-to-day decisions. That's more based off what I see as a coach. But if I'm seeing, the trend of, we haven't had a good week and we're 2 weeks out and we're trying to work on, obviously our competition lifts or our plan for our openers, can I look back and see why we're coming up short now and what can I quickly modify to make sure that we get back on the right page in time? The same goes for competition performance. I think sometimes we, both as coaches and athletes, fall into that trap of, we're just so locked in on a particular number heading into a meet or a certain total, and we're missing, that bigger picture of how training is going. And like, yeah, you didn't make your last attempt, which was a PR at the meet, but, we opened at our heaviest opener ever. And we were able to do that because we practiced it more times in training and we saw that we were making it and building confidence at it. And I'll also add that I think it's important at times to both share that stuff with the athlete and sometimes to not. You need to know your lifter, and some lifters won't respond well to them seeing that data. Maybe it's not painting the best picture at the moment, and it's better served if I don't share that with them. I just take it and make the adjustments I need to make, as opposed to the alternative where, yeah, if things are going great, that might be used to give them a confidence boost. Like, hey, I know you didn't PR in training, but you hit your old number and you did it more times than you ever have in the past, or you hit it at a certain speed you've never lifted it before. Like, these are great signs that you're ready for more. And I think that could have a really positive spin in the athlete's mind of, just building confidence that even if I haven't done it yet, I've shown some, quantitative data that I've gotten better and I'm ready when competition day rolls around and I get some rest, like this bar is going to fly.
We love that. So data and technology is one. What other strategies do you use specifically to bring out the best in your athletes during performance?
I would say it starts really with our preparation in the gym. I have always been a big believer of, and I think most coaches in weightlifting agree, like when we're getting ready for a big meet, not just one we're kind of training up to and not taking a whole lot of rest heading into, I want as many training sessions as I can without killing the athlete, where they're going to get to practice a heavy total day to put them in that mindset of, I know some people like to split up, we snatch one day heavy, we clean and jerk one day heavy. I've always been a big believer that like we need as many heavy total days as we can get to either see where we're falling short or to build up that confidence of, hey, I've done near my max total on really tired legs in the middle of my training cycle. That way, when I get to competition day and I feel good, I have no doubt that I'm going to be able to make it through that. I'm also big on trying not to let people get too comfortable in training. I think we all fall into that trap where, it's a certain platform every day or a certain barbell, and then we get to a meet and it throws us off. I've always told people, I play games with them in the gym. I'll walk in front of them while they're taking a lift. I know that's kind of frowned upon in weightlifting, but as the coach, I do it to test their focus. It's going to happen at a meet when you're in the back at a national meet. Like someone might stand on your platform while you're warming up. Well, that's going to throw you into like a tailspin where you're mentally not feeling good lifting. Then that's a problem. So we're going to practice that in training. Or, being used to lifting in a loud and chaotic environment versus lifting in a quiet session. Just trying to play with some of those environmental variables during training, because I don't think it's usually the lifting that gets a lifter off their game at a comp. If their training's gone well, they've hit their numbers, they know what they're capable of. It's not really a guessing game. It's always the external stuff, the people they're seeing
Right.
around them, or the noise, the environment, the stage, the lights. So the more I can make the lifter uncomfortable in training when we're doing those heavier total sessions, the more comfortable they should hopefully feel on competition day. And we'll talk about some of that stuff. If an athlete says, I really have trouble, focusing in the back room, we'll try and come up with certain strategies. Do you need headphones in? Do you need certain cues? Do you need to be left alone? Whatever it may be. Just like tailoring programming to people, I really try to tailor how I handle athletes in the back to whatever they want. As you stated earlier, you have to ask the athlete what they know about themselves. I can't just assume every lifter wants to be slapped in the face before they go out for a heavy lift. Some don't. Some want quiet. They don't even want to talk about their lifts while they're warming up. And we're just going to joke around in the back and have a good time. And again, it's on the coach to always understand who it is you're working with, not just, the physical side of it. Like, hey, it's time to hit this number. Maybe, giving them certain things to think about, or just asking them questions that are way off topic from weightlifting in the back. Distract them, whatever is going to give them the best chance to feel like themselves when they step out on the platform.
Right. The first time I had an athlete ask me to slap them in the face was probably one of the most terrifying,
Traumatizing.
traumatizing situations in my entire coaching career. And the dude is like 6'5", and here I am. He's like, slap me in the face. And I'm like, way up there? You want me to slap you in the face? So that was quite interesting, because this person in the gym is really, really like self-sufficient, comes in, does their training. They just, they're in their zone. They listen to their music. They do their lifts. They leave. And so to get to competition, and they're like, all right, coach, slap me in the face. And I'm like, whoa, wasn't prepared for that. So that's always an
Oh, yeah.
interesting scenario. Then I have some athletes who they're like, I don't want to know what's going on in the bar. I don't want to know what I'm opening at. I don't want to know what the competition is doing. I'm just here to do whatever you tell me to do. And I'm like, yes, athlete, we like you.
Yeah, both scenarios are great. Again, the bigger the meet, usually, I usually try to sit down with an athlete pre-comp a week or two out before we're even talking about exact numbers, and just lay out expectations. What are we looking to achieve at this meet? How do you feel about it, both mentally and physically heading into it? And then, like, what do you want in the back of that day? What do you want me to do? Is there anything I can do that's going to make you more comfortable, especially if it's someone who's coming over, and it's their first or second meet with me? I don't want to assume anything about them. So we'll sit down and have that conversation, hopefully a couple weeks out. That way there are no surprises. You don't show up on meet day and, they're the most calm lifter in the world in the gym, and all of a sudden they're, hyperventilating. They can't catch their breath because they're so anxious, snatching. Like, let's address that stuff now so we know what we maybe can address in the gym. Or, if you're going to ask me to slap you, don't throw me off when we're in the middle of a competition. I want to know ahead of time if you're going to ask for that.
You've shared a lot of really great things that you're implementing, things that you've learned. What else have you learned in your decade or more of coaching and business ownership that you want to share?
Well, I think the biggest thing coaching wise has always been that, you're never going to know what you don't know to begin with. Like, there are so many different ways to get to the result you want. I think we as coaches tend to get really caught up where we argue with other coaches, your way's wrong and my way's better. It's like, at the end of the day, if we're all getting to the same result, like, that's fine. Teach me something about your way. How did you get there and I got there, but maybe we took two totally different routes, and maybe I can incorporate something you're doing. So I think just being flexible as a coach. I'm, again, fortunate. I had a rather strange introduction to weightlifting, just not being in the sport for a long time, but I got to learn from a lot of different strength and conditioning coaches, all who had very different approaches to their program design, to their, language they used with athletes. And it really had a good influence on me, some showing me what I don't ever want to do, but some really giving me different examples of, like, hey, they're all being successful. Their athletes are getting better. They're well respected. They're, they have positive relationships with the people they work with. What can I take away from each thing they've done? So that's really been the biggest thing on the coaching side that I've learned is, I am about 10 years in now, decade as of 2024. And I feel like I've scratched the surface on a lot of this stuff, especially as it relates to getting to that higher end of performance, especially in weightlifting specifically. I am still just learning. My first time going through it with a couple lifters, and there's just no limit to how many different scenarios are going to pop up or different ways we can do it. So, and I think as a business owner, kind of addressing the same thing. One, don't own a gym. It's the worst business ever. Not why I got into owning a gym. People ask me that all the time. Did you always want to, open a gym or be a, entrepreneur, business owner? And I said, no, I hate that part of it. I just wanted to do things in a manner that I thought was appropriate for this sport. I saw an opportunity in the region that I was in where there wasn't a ton of other weightlifting gyms already for a state that is really populated with them. And I thought I could just bring a slightly different perspective as to how we get there, having a different background. Again, not coming up through weightlifting, but if I could do it differently on a serious note, it would be to start smaller. I had this grand vision of I'm going to start and people are going to, run in the door to see me. And that's just not how it goes. I think every gym owner understands that after they've started their business. And just to be patient, it's been a very slow and organic growth for the team here, which I've been happy with. I've never been a huge one for marketing. I've always been more eggs in the basket of just building better relationships with the people in the gym, and that will lead to more. And that was some great advice that I got from some coaches when I started off as a business owner, like, hey, your business will grow when you're producing the right people inside those walls. And that was really some great advice. Although I will say, like I said, I think not overextending as a business owner in the beginning is definitely something I would do differently.
Right. What is missing from our coaching profession, specifically weightlifting? What do we still need? What do we need to get better and enhance our profession as weightlifting coaches?
I think the biggest thing is just the communication between coaches. And I think a lot of weightlifting coaches, and we're getting better at it, I will say that. And I am very fortunate to be in Florida, where I think the weightlifting community, largely in part at least, is very open and sharing with each other. You can approach most coaches here and, ask them about their program or an athlete of theirs, and they'll happily share what they're doing. But I also feel like weightlifting as a whole still has this stigma of like, I don't want to tell you what I'm doing, because there's this weird dynamic where, we all want to represent USA weightlifting, but we are individual entities as club owners or coaches of a club. And, there's that feeling of like, I don't want to give away a secret. Well, there are no secrets. Like, all of us pulled our answers from the same textbooks and podcasts and research articles. And like, to me, that's what's holding it back the most. But again, it's getting a lot better. You see the growth of things like podcasts with other coaches who are openly sharing what they're doing, and really driving the sport forward. And I think it's shown through the performance in USA weightlifting just how much deeper we're getting at the national and international level. It's not just a few shining stars anymore. There's, a few people in line waiting to try and take a spot at, that podium on a national meet, which is great. But I still think it's the biggest area that needs more work. There's just not a lot of opportunities for coaches to get together and share ideas about the actual profession. And then you look at kind of the smaller, within a gym, your gym might have a coach or two. If you're lucky, you're at a bigger gym, you might have 3 or 4. Like, that's still a pretty small amount of people. As opposed to, say, you work in, team sports, you might have a dozen people on that staff that can all bounce ideas off one another and discuss things. And, a lot of these smaller clubs, I know for years, it was just me in my 4 walls, and, there's not a lot of other people to turn to. I go read, I listen to podcasts, and fortunately I could call some people and ask them their advice. Just missing that sharing component of being open with everyone, that, me helping you get better helps both of us get better in the long run, and is really what's best for the athletes. I'm a big believer that competition drives success. We shouldn't be trying to hide that from one another in an attempt to, beat somebody else. Like, we're all here for the same reason. Let's push each other forward instead of just holding back on the things we do know.
Really love that. Competition drives success. And I agree. I do think that we're fortunate to be in Florida, where we do get to bounce ideas off of each other. And you see it in the back room where, 3 or 4 coaches are sitting there talking about different aspects of competition and training, and, what an athlete is doing. And you have to balance not sharing secrets and strategies, and directly with your competitor. But at the end of the day, we have to prioritize the improvement of our athletes, because that's who we're here to serve. And I think that if we can do that more in the Olympic weightlifting profession, I think it will produce even more high level skilled athletes.
For sure. Like I said, I think we're getting a lot better. And I don't mean that. I don't mean in the back. We're not gonna, if you and I are coaching against each other, I'm not gonna tell you what we're doing. My job is to make my athlete have their best day out there.
Right.
If that means that we're, burning a clock on another coach, so be it. But, to be able to sit down after the meet or before the meet or during training and just talk about, why we did certain things or, maybe something you're stuck on with another coach, I think is something that we can all still do better at. Because again, there is so many different ways to get to that end result that we're all trying to get to. And I think we all get a little stubborn too sometimes. I know I'm guilty of it, of thinking like we got the answer. But then you hear someone else talk about it and you're like, man, I never even thought to do it that way. And that makes even more sense than what I thought I already knew. So,
right. Zach, before I let you go, I have a little game of rapid fire, this or that. Trying to get to know you a little bit better. First answer that comes to your mind. Got maybe about 8 or 10 of these. You ready?
All right, fire away.
All right, here we go. Morning training or evening session?
Morning. Depends what we define as morning, though. Late morning. I'm not an early morning person.
10 o'clock, 10 a.m.
Oh, perfect. Tell everyone. If we could all train from like 10 to 2 and then go home for the day, that'd be wonderful. Enough time to wake up, but I don't want to be there when it's dark either.
That would be ideal. All right, here we go. Snatch or clean and jerk?
Snatch.
Squats or pulls?
Neither. Squats.
Kettlebells or dumbbells?
Kettlebells.
Volume or strength cycle?
That's not a fair question. Depends where we're at. Strength cycle.
Okay. Lyrics or instrumentals during training?
Doesn't matter. Pet peeve.
As long as it's Country Music Friday, huh?
Heck yeah.
Local meet or international comp?
Well, I can't truly answer that one because I've not been to an international one yet. Even though a lifter of ours has made their first one, I did not get to go. I love them both, though. Honestly, I'm not going to pick one either, whether it's national or local. The camaraderie at local meets is awesome. It's a chance to get together with other coaches. Where at national meets, we're usually a little more business-like. So they're both awesome in their own regard, both stressful in their own ways, too.
I would agree. They're very stressful in different ways. Nike Romaleos or Adipowers?
Nike all day. I'm a Nike brat.
Reading books or listening to podcasts when traveling to meets?
Ooh, travel, I'm going to say podcast just because I can't read and drive. I also don't like reading on planes. So podcast during travel, but I like reading more in general.
Beach or mountains?
Mountains.
That surprised me. I just knew you were going to say the beach. Well, thank you so much. You moved to the beach.
I was going to say, I moved to the beach because I came from the mountains. And now that I've lived in both, I miss the mountains more. If I could have both, that'd be great. If I could live on the beach and turn around and see mountains in the back, that would be great. Unfortunately, that's not Florida. So
California is your friend. When I was there, I was 30 minutes. Yeah. There's airplanes. All right. So this podcast is all about going beyond the reps and sets and getting to the strength in the detail. So what is your one takeaway you want listeners to gain from this episode? What is your strength in the detail?
I think the detail is that the details matter. And by that, I mean, we as coaches always talk about the big things we should be doing right, and we overlook some of the little things. And it's not to say that they're little things for a reason. They're not the biggest things we need to focus on right out of the gate, but there is so much to learn reading between the lines. Kind of what we discussed a little bit with, data or tracking or whatever it may be with programming. It is not the end all be all, but there is so much to learn and to implement, and that can help you as a coach, not just help your athlete, but give you a better picture of what you're doing or show you what you're not doing well. So I am a very detail-oriented person. I tell everyone that meets me, whether it's a technical thing or the way we program. Read between the lines, people. There's a ton of stuff out there that you're just skipping over. And it's unfortunately just part of the profession. It's your job to go and do that work. When you clock out, you're not done. That just means you're going to go do some work somewhere else to keep learning how you can do better when it's time to walk back in the gym. So
thank you so much, Zack, for your time. I look forward to releasing this episode and getting more people to understand the details of programming and coaching.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure to be here.